From Vermont, this is Democracy Now!
A few years ago, we raised the issue. Hey, maybe, this is really radical idea, my God. Not to be discussed on television for sure, not to be discussed in the halls of Congress. Maybe the wealthiest country in the history of the world, 50 miles away from the Canadian border. Maybe, just maybe, we might want to do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege.
As Democrats prepare to take control of the House, pressure is growing on the Democratic leadership to embrace Medicare for all. We'll hear from leading advocates for single-payer health care in the United States and in Britain. They're here in Vermont for a gathering of international progressives hosted by the Sanders Institute. We'll air the opening keynote address by Senator Bernie Sanders, who takes on health care, raising the minimum wage, and how the Senate just made history by advancing his bipartisan resolution to end military support for the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing of Yemen.
In the Senate on Tuesday or Wednesday, we're going to win that resolution that says the United States has got to end its relationship with the Saudi despotic regime there and get out of Yemen.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's former longtime personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress about Trump's efforts to build a skyscraper in Moscow while he was running for president. Cohen admitted in court Thursday he lied when he said plans for Trump's Moscow project ended before the Iowa caucus in February of 2016. In fact, Cohen worked on the project up until June 2016 and continued to give direct updates to Donald Trump, who's identified as Individual 1 in the court documents. Cohen also admitted he directly spoke with a Kremlin official about the project and even considered arranging for Trump to travel to Moscow after the 2016 Republican convention. Cohen said he lied to Congress in an attempt to be consistent with Trump's, quote, political messaging that the campaign had no ties to Russia. Michael Cohen's admission comes less than 2 weeks before he's scheduled to be sentenced on other charges. In August, he pleaded guilty to 8 criminal charges, including tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations. President Trump reacted to Thursday's news by calling Cohen a liar who was trying to decrease his prison sentence. But Trump insisted that he did nothing wrong.
We had a position to possibly do a deal to build a building of some kind in Moscow. I decided not to do it. The primary reason, there could have been other reasons, but the primary reason, it was very simple. I was focused on running for president. There would be nothing wrong if I did do it. I was running my business while I was campaigning. There was a good chance that I wouldn't have won, in which case I would have gone back into the business. And why should I lose lots of opportunities?
Meanwhile, BuzzFeed News is reporting the Trump Organization planned to give a $50 million penthouse at the proposed Trump Tower Moscow to Russian President Vladimir Putin. As the news about Cohen's guilty plea broke, President Trump announced via Twitter he's canceling his meeting with Russian President Putin at the G20 summit in Argentina. The tweet came less than an hour after he told reporters the meeting was still on. The reason Trump gave for the cancellation was Russia's refusal to return the Ukrainian ships and sailors that were seized over the weekend. In Germany, Deutsche Bank's headquarters were raided on Thursday as part of a probe into money laundering. The probe stems from the 2016 Panama Papers affair, which revealed mass money laundering and tax evasion schemes set up by the Mossack Fonseca law firm. Deutsche Bank is President Trump's largest lender, with Trump reportedly owing hundreds of millions of dollars to the German bank for real estate loans dating back some 20 years. As thousands of Central American migrants continue to camp out by the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana, a small group of women from the caravan announced Thursday they're starting a hunger strike to protest the asylum process and the migrants' treatment. Steady rain has worsened conditions for the caravan members, who are mostly sleeping and living outdoors. Members of the caravan have been organizing to demand better conditions and fair treatment from authorities. This is one of the members speaking at a press conference.
So what this exodus is asking is, 1, to stop the arbitrary, involuntary, manipulative deportations. 2, for the United States President Donald Trump, we ask for a more efficient asylum process since everyone has a right to ask for political asylum. 3, we also ask for the formation of a commission by the incoming Mexican government to negotiate a permanent solution for those who want to stay here. 4, make public the names of those deported because they're deported and their families here don't hear anything or know what happened. And 5, for there always to be a human rights presence during all detentions to protect migrants' rights.
Media outlets are reporting the tear gas used against migrants at the border was supplied by U.S. company Safariland, which is headed by Warren Kanders, a prominent political donor who's contributed to both Republican and Democratic candidates, including Senator Cory Booker and Hillary Clinton. Earlier today, outside the G20, Trump joined outgoing Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in signing a new trade deal to replace NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The deal still needs to be ratified by each country. Peña Nieto signed the deal on his last day in office. Mexico's new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will be sworn in on Saturday. A Honduran court has convicted 7 men for the murder of Honduran indigenous environmental leader Berta Cáceres. Cáceres, a winner of the Goldman Prize for Environmental Defenders, was fighting the construction of a major hydroelectric dam on sacred indigenous land when she was shot dead in her home in March 2016, just 2 days before her 45th birthday. The court ruled the murder of Cáceres was ordered by executives of the Honduran company behind the dam known as DESA, who hired the convicted hitmen to carry out the killing. After the sentencing, Olivia Zuniga, Cáceres' oldest daughter, demanded that the masterminds behind the murder be brought to justice.
We will not support this until the authorities bring to justice the masterminds of this murder, with a DESA official being linked, also officials from the last 3 illegitimate governments, as a result of a coup that has taken place in the country. The authorities are committing grave acts of corruption.
In Northern California, the search for human remains from the Camp Fire ended Thursday, 3 weeks after the deadliest wildfire in California history scorched the town of Paradise, killing 88 people. Nearly 200 are still reported missing. Meanwhile, heavy rains and flooding in the region this week prompted evacuation warnings for residents still reeling from the devastation. This comes as Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke is being accused of using the deadly wildfire to advance provisions in a new farm bill. The bill seeks to make logging in federal forests easier by fast-tracking forest management projects and removing the environmental review process. While visiting Paradise this week, Zinke suggested thinning forests could help prevent wildfires, but recent studies have found that logged forests with low environmental protections experience more destructive wildfires. Meanwhile, a new report from Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting finds the effects of wildfires on human health last long after the smoke has cleared. The report looks at last year's Tubbs fire, which tore through Northern California's Sonoma County and Napa Valley, and found that area hospitals saw an increase of 20% in emergency room visits for both respiratory and cardiac problems 3 months after the wildfire. CNN fired contributor and Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill Thursday following his speech at the United Nations in support of Palestinian rights. Lamont Hill's comments sparked backlash among conservatives and pro-Israeli government groups who singled out his use of the phrase "Free Palestine from the river to the sea," which they say is used by Hamas and anti-Israel groups.
So as we stand here on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the tragic commemoration of the Nakba, we have an opportunity to not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires. And that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Mark Lamont Hill defended his comments on Twitter yesterday after the news broke, writing, quote, "I support Palestinian freedom. I support Palestinian self-determination. I am deeply critical of Israeli policy and practice. I do not support anti-Semitism, killing Jewish people, or any of the other things attributed to my speech. I have spent my life fighting these things," he said. In the Philippines, leading independent news site The Rappler and its CEO and executive editor, Maria Ressa, have been indicted on tax evasion charges. The case is seen as the latest attack against the press by the authoritarian Philippines president, Rodrigo Duterte. Last week, Democracy Now! Spoke to Maria Ressa in our New York studio.
These are all political attacks against us. They haven't shut us down. We continue operating, but we are fighting many cases, 6 or 7 different investigations and legal cases. And these cases it's like a war of attrition. But we continue to do investigative work, and we continue to expose impunity that is happening at all levels.
Maria Ressa was given the Knight Fellowship Award as well as the Gwynne Eiffel Press Freedom Award by the Committee to Protect Journalists. The New York Times is reporting Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg requested research on billionaire liberal donor George Soros after he made public remarks critical of Facebook in January, in which he said the company was a menace to society. Soros is an investor in Facebook. The company says the research into Soros was already underway at the time of Sandberg's request. Earlier this month, the Times revealed Facebook hired conservative opposition research firm Definers Public Affairs to investigate and discredit critics of the social networking site, including by linking some critics to Soros. The digital news publisher Mike has laid off most of its staff after being acquired by Bustle Digital Group. The company, which positioned itself as a video-driven media outlet for millennials, had been steadily losing viewers over the past year. The company employed around 100 people. South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott said Thursday he will oppose the nomination of Thomas Farr for a lifetime federal judgeship in eastern North Carolina. Scott, who is the sole African-American Republican in the Senate, cited Farr's role in Jesse Helms' Senate campaigns in 1984 and 1990, which engaged in voter intimidation and suppression targeted North Carolina's black voters. Scott's opposition to Farr would likely be the deciding vote, with Senator Jeff Flake also voting no, along with the entire Democratic caucus. Police arrested a man in Atlanta suspected of shooting and injuring 2 teenagers at an Alabama mall last week. At the time of the incident, police officers killed a different man after responding to the shooting at the mall in suburban Birmingham and firing on 21-year-old Emantic Fitzgerald Bradford, Jr. Protests are continuing in Alabama to protest Bradford's wrongful killing. In Australia, thousands of students walked out of class today to demand action on climate change in a nationwide student strike.
Well, I think our government needs to take more action on climate change so that our generation and our kids' generations and their kids can have a future that's sustainable and healthy and a planet that we haven't destroyed. Students of all ages are calling for their government to stop the construction of new coal mines and move towards 100% renewable energy by 2030. The protests come as eastern Australia is experiencing record-breaking wildfires with close to 200 separate fires identified this week. And in Buenos Aires, community leaders and activists from around Latin America are holding the People's Summit, a counter-conference to the G20 summit outside Argentina's Congress building. Participants demonstrated at the official meetings with signs denouncing the G20 and the International Monetary Fund. This is a representative from an indigenous community in Argentina.
It's really easy to make decisions and plans without the participation of those who it truly matters to. And that's the way things are done, to benefit the few and not to benefit everyone.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We are broadcasting from Colchester, Vermont, from the studios of Vermont PBS. The U.S. midterms have made history, with an unprecedented 100 women elected to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, among them the first Native American women, Muslim women, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But there's another first that's been far less covered: the record number of new lawmakers who campaigned for Medicare for all. There are nearly 50 of them. Also in the last year, 123 incumbent House Democrats co-sponsored Medicare for All legislation. That's double the number who supported the bill in the previous legislative session. But there is a group that's paying close attention. That's the pharmaceutical, insurance, and hospital industry. As The Intercept's Li Fang reports, over the summer, the groups formed a partnership to fight the growing support for expanding Medicare. Documents obtained by The Intercept reveal the group aims to, quote, change the conversation around Medicare for All and minimize the potential for this option in health care from becoming part of a national political party's platform in 2020, unquote. Despite this, the movement for single-payer health care is growing. There is now a Medicare for All caucus co-chaired by Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, which advocates say is a sign of lawmakers' increasing interest in the issue. Well, Democracy Now! Is broadcasting from Vermont, just in Colchester, outside Burlington, where progressive leaders have traveled for the Sanders Institute gathering. Last night, Senator Bernie Sanders kicked off the event with a keynote speech, which will play later in the broadcast. But we're starting with some of the organizers who've come to town to talk to Medicare for All. Kelly Coogan-Gare is the Assistant Director of Public and Community Advocacy at National Nurses United. Dr. Hosnia Jafari-Marbini is an anesthesiologist and Labour City councillor in Britain. And Joe Beardsmore is an advisor on the campaign for Medicare for All with National Nurses United and with Momentum, and a senior advisor at the Social Practice facilitating collaboration between organizers in the UK and the United States. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! We're going to begin this conversation by talking to Kelly Coogan-Gare. Talk about what is happening in the United States. I think the hospital industry is paying very close attention, the drug industry and the insurance industry. But what the kind of momentum that the Medicare for All movement is gaining and what Medicare for All is?
So Medicare for All is guaranteed health care for all Americans. It's portable. It's free at the point of delivery. And it also essentially brings a multi-payer system into a single payer. So you have the insurance industries, you have the government, you have individuals and families, and that would, in a single payer system, all be brought together and therefore be much more sort of administratively efficient than our multi-payer system is now. Several studies have come out from conservative think tanks, from liberal think tanks. All of them confirm that a Medicare for All system, a single-payer system, it's the same thing, would save Americans substantial amounts of money. I think what we're seeing is, for decades, people have known that Medicare for All will guarantee health care for everybody. I think unions and working people understand that delinking health care from employment status will increase the industrial power of working people. But I think what's happening now is actually really unique, and that is that we are in an era of proto-fascism. And I think Americans at an intuitive level understand that given that right now healthcare spending is 18% of our gross domestic product, by 2026 it will be over 20% of our gross domestic product. By fighting for Medicare for All, the American people understand that they are taking back a fifth of their economy and that they are bringing it back into public accountability. They are bringing it back essentially to the people. And so it's a much bigger fight than just guaranteeing health care for all Americans. And I think that's why we are finding this level of deep commitment and enthusiasm.
And how big is it here in the country? I mean, 50 newly elected lawmakers, roughly, almost 50, ran on that platform.
Right. Well, their constituents are saying to them that this is what they want. The people are putting pressure on establishment politicians. This is what they want. They want their politicians to support guaranteed health care for all Americans. And I think that... How is the Democratic leadership responding? Well, I think one of our biggest, you were talking about the pharmaceutical industries, you were talking about other for-profit industries like hospital industries. I think one of the biggest forms of inoculation is the extreme center of the Democratic Party that is trying to respond with a public option. And so basically keeping the insurance industry in the driver's seat, keeping the existing financing mechanisms of our healthcare system in the driver's seat, and offering sort of this option that people can go into and get publicly funded healthcare. But what that's going to do is the sickest individuals are going to go into that system, and it's going to make it look like Medicare for all is much more expensive than it actually is.
I wanted to turn to Jafari, to Hosnia Jafari Marbini, a doctor and anesthesiologist in Britain. Explain how Britain adopted the system that it got.
So actually the NHS, the National Health Service, came into being at the end of the Second World War. And this was at a time when the UK was at its knees after the war. And it was a publicly funded, publicly provided and publicly accountable service. And the NHS is hugely popular and revered in the UK. It's more of a national obsession than a great cup of tea or the weather, and it really makes or breaks elections if people feel that politicians are not looking after the NHS. But what we've seen in the UK since the Conservatives have been in power has been a privatisation and market-based approach, bringing in different providers and a fragmentation of service, which is affecting the patients I see who are getting, for example, social care visits that are 10 minutes long and completely inadequate. And we're actually fighting this neoliberal ideology alongside the Americans. So it is actually the same ideology that we're battling, but from different starting points.
We're going to go to a break and then come back to this discussion and find a talk with someone who's been negotiating on both sides of the pond, who's been mobilizing here in this country, bringing that back to the UK, and then bringing back UK's successes to the United States. Stay with us.
Keeps the doctor away. You've heard the old saying, no doubt, and I'm sure it is true, but between me and you, there ain't many apples about. Though they grow on a tree, money doesn't, you see, and you've got to have money to buy. It's the same with your health, it depends on your wealth, so if you are poor, you must cry. Can we afford the doctor, the dentist, the midwife, the nurse? It doesn't seem fair.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Vermont PBS, just outside Burlington and Colchester. Today and tomorrow in Burlington, there is a gathering that's sponsored by the Sanders Institute. Senator Sanders spoke last night. We're going to hear his speech in a moment, speaking to a gathering of international progressives. One of the key issues here is the issue of Medicare for All. There's a new caucus in Congress right now, the Medicare for All caucus. Something like 48 of the newly elected Congress members ran on a Medicare for All platform. Our guests are Kelly Coogan-Gair of National Nurses United, Dr. Hosnia Jafari Marbini, an anesthesiologist in Britain who speaks for nationalized health care in the United Kingdom, and also Joe Beardsmore. Joe, talk about your work here and in Britain.
So I'm helping to organise on the Medicare for All campaign and to mobilise the hundreds of thousands of people who are fighting for healthcare justice in the US. And we're doing that using campaigning techniques that have been used both in the US and in the UK. So we're seeing similar political moments on both sides of the pond. In the US, we saw Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016, which mobilised an unprecedented number of people in the fight for social justice. In the UK, we saw a similar movement propelled Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party, becoming one of the most significant and powerful political figures in the UK. Now, these things didn't just happen by accident or by coincidence. It was the result of active solidarity by Americans and people in the UK who are fighting for the same just causes. Now we're bringing those campaigning techniques, which focus on talking to all voters and listening to their concerns, and we're bringing that to the Medicare for All campaign. So we have volunteers who are out knocking on doors and making phone calls every single weekend. And this movement is led by nurses. And that's very relevant because nurses are the people who are on the front lines of the healthcare crisis in the United States. They're leading this campaign in the fight for Medicare for all. And it's a fight we really believe we can win, because we are seeing these emergence of new campaigning techniques which allow far more people than ever before to engage in politics. We saw it at the recent midterm elections, the number of volunteers who stepped forward to help elect progressive politicians. And now we're seeing that energy directed into causes like the fight for healthcare justice in the US.
Kelly Coogan-Gare, in the lead up to 2020, what is your new approach? I mean, before Bernie Sanders ran for president and shocked all by the enormous momentum that he gained as he pushed for Medicare for all and other issues, I mean, you're in a whole different landscape right now.
That's exactly right. So as Joe started to mention, we are moving into a modality of organizing called big organizing. And for those who are familiar with organizing methods, there's an organizing method called Alinsky, the Alinsky method, and it's sort of one-on-one personal conversations.
Name for Saul Alinsky.
Yes, yes. And what we're trying to do is use the technologies that mediate our everyday lives to scale up in a matter of weeks to literally reach hundreds of thousands of people. And this methodology for organizing was developed on the Bernie 2016 campaign, and is one of the reasons why I think Bernie became such a household name so quickly. And it allows us to use phone banks and text messages to literally reach people with our message about Medicare for All, and then get them engaged and taking on leadership roles.
So what are the critical issues that people are most concerned about healthcare in this country?
Cost. I mean, when people talk about single payer and they say to me, well, how could we possibly afford it? How can we not afford single payer? Not even for the moral and ethical reasons, but you have 85 million Americans who are underinsured. And officially what that means is that 10% of their income goes into copays and deductibles. You have 1 in 3 Americans in the course of their lifetime declaring bankruptcy because of medical costs. You have over 40% of Americans within 2 years of being diagnosed with cancer going through their entire life savings. This is unconscionable. We absolutely can't afford it. And when Republicans take the message and reframe it, what they are focusing on is they are focusing on federal health care expenditure. But every single study, even from the conservative Mercatus Institute that came out this past summer, shows
this is the Koch brothers funded.
This is the Koch brothers funded libertarian $2 trillion of savings over the course of 10 years using extraordinarily conservative metrics.
And today there's going to be a major report revealed at the Sanders gathering on
which
the cost
actually
of
reveals
Medicare for all.
Similar findings. I mean, what's fascinating, the savings that this report will reveal is a little bit greater. But it's fascinating that on both the libertarian end and on sort of the more left progressive end, both ends of the spectrum are seeing savings, but where they're seeing savings is in the national health expenditure.
And how do you address people's concerns they can't choose their own doctor?
Of course you can choose your own doctor. Yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, people are going to have more freedom of choice.
That you'll wait on lines, that you won't ever get to see whoever that doctor is.
I think that a lot of that kind of stuff will have to play out once the legislation gets passed, once the regulation process begins. But and you know, another huge issue, of course, is that we need an increase in the number of primary care doctors, and once that were to happen, people wouldn't have to wait in line. But then we also have to then, of course, address the exorbitant cost of medical school and higher education.
Dr. Jafari Marbini, as you look at the struggles here, what would you advise people in the United States based on your own involvement in the National Health Service in Britain?
It's really interesting what Kelly was just talking about, because actually in the UK, outsourcing has actually cost us a huge amount of money.
That means the privatizing of your
So, for example, maintenance
system
of hospitals is being done by outsourcing via now bankrupt Carillion maintenance service. And actually changing a light bulb the cost of changing a light bulb has been rising dramatically. And actually that outsourcing and the fragmentation is a real issue that we are trying to get away from. And I think the only way to do that is to look at progressive politics and get away from this marketization and neoliberal ideology, which has been so prominent both in the UK and in the USA politically.
Joe Beardsmore, you see both systems operating. So what is the message, and what did you take from the Bernie Sanders campaign back to the Jeremy Corbyn campaign? He's the second most powerful person now in Britain behind Prime Minister Theresa May. He's the head of the opposition party, the Labour Party.
Well, we learned that in order to mobilise people to take action on the scale needed to win big progressive causes, we have to offer them a big political vision which will inspire them to take action. We saw that with Bernie, we saw that with Jeremy, and now we're seeing that with Medicare for All. It's not enough to offer small technical solutions to these big complicated problems that just tinker at the edges. We have to offer bold solutions which really match the scale of the problems we face. When we do that, we can build volunteer armies which are actually able to overpower corporate interests and establishment politicians. And that's how progressives like Jeremy Corbyn are going to win in the UK. That's how we'll defend healthcare justice in the UK and save the NHS. And it's also how we're going to win Medicare for All here in this country.
Finally, Kelly, the difference between the British system and the Canadian system?
So the British system is a nationalized healthcare system. The government owns the hospital. The hospital workers, healthcare workers, are government workers. In the United States, the provisioning of care would still remain private. We already have Medicare right now. It's for those 65, 67 and older. It would be expanded to everybody. So and
we're going to hear Bernie Sanders talk about that in just 1 minute. I want to thank you all for being with us. Kelly Coogan-Gare, Assistant Director of Public and Community Advocacy at National Nurses United. We've also been joined by Hasnia Jafari-Marbini, anesthesiologist, Labour City Councillor in United Kingdom, and Joe Beardsmore, advisor on the campaign for Medicare for All with National Nurses United, as well as the group Momentum in Britain. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Bernie Sanders speaks.
But like the weaver sang to us, wasn't that a time when we raised our hands and voices on the line? And we all sang Bread and Roses, Joe Hill and Union Maid. We linked our arms and told each other we were not afraid. Solidarity forever would go rolling through the hall. We shall overcome together, one and all. The more I study history, the more I seem to find that for every generation there are times just like that time.
Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Colchester, Vermont, just outside Burlington, where hundreds of international progressive leaders have traveled for a gathering hosted by the Sanders Institute. Last night, former presidential candidate, independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders kicked the event off with a keynote speech. He was introduced by Harvard University professor Cornel West.
It is highly appropriate that the rich legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Dorothy Day, and the Edward Zaids and others, all of them trying to keep a focus on poor and working people in the midst of the American empire, in the midst of the American democratic experiment. Then here comes a brother from Brooklyn, mediated in Vermont, who becomes the great political figure in the context of such truncated electoral politics in this nation, that raises the banner of working people and says, Wall Street, you're too greedy. What about working people and poor people? Neoliberal capitalism, you got greed running amok. I might start with 2% of even 2% of folk knowing even who I am for the most part, because I'm popular in this John Dewey-dominated Vermont state. But they may not know you in Arizona, in Nevada, and California, but once they hear your voice, this is what we're talking about. We are here because there's too many folks suffering. when our dear brother Bernie Sanders stepped forward, and I heard his voice, and I looked in his eyes, I saw the window of his soul. I said, he's for real. He's not one of those simulacra and semblances who want to use the language but not want to bear the burden and engage in the service to working people. So I am blessed tonight to introduce to you one of those who, when the history is written, of those who raise their voices for poor and working people, Bernie Sanders will be one of those voices. My dear brother Bernie, come and share your voice, my brother. Come and share your voice.
My news today is, good news and bad news. The good news, and Cornell just mentioned this, and it tells you what all of you know. I mean, this is a group of people who work in progressive politics every day. And all of you know that change always comes from the bottom, not from the top. And all of you know, and what this institute is exactly about, is to try to educate, go beyond the corporate media, to talk about the real issues facing real people. And just the other day, we had a real example of what could happen. It turns out that even, Cornell used the word truncated Congress. Man, I'll give you some better words next time. All right? Might be a corporately owned Congress. Or might be other things. But even there, it turns out that when you explain what the American people really did not hear much about, that in this terribly poor country of Yemen, very poor country, turns out that in the last 3 years, because of the Saudi-led invasion and intervention in that civil war, 85,000 children have died of starvation. According to the United Nations, millions of people are on the brink of starvation. 10,000 new cases of cholera break out every single week because the Saudi military has bombed the water infrastructure in Yemen, so there is no clean water available. You're looking at the destruction of a very poor country. Nobody in America knew that. But it turns out that when you start talking about that issue, and Cornell is right, everyone's worried about one journalist. What a terrible tragedy that was. But what about the 85,000 children who starved to death? Maybe that's a tragedy as well. So it turned out that when you're able to raise the issue, kind of break through things, that we were able just yesterday to win a significant vote. And I think in the Senate on Tuesday or Wednesday, we're going to win that resolution that says the United States has got to end its relationship with the Saudi despotic regime there and get out of Yemen. But it raises a profound question, and that is, how the hell do we ever get into a relationship with a government like that? And once again, everybody says, oh, my God, they killed Jamal Khashoggi. It was a terrible, brutal. The guy walks into a consulate, a safe haven. They kill him and they cut him up. How horrible is that? But that is just one example of what that regime is about. Our longtime ally, where if a woman is going to get a job in Saudi Arabia, she has to get the permission of some male, to allow her to get the job or to go to school. All right. Well, you got a handful of corrupt billionaires who run that country. If anyone stands up and protests, they get jailed. So maybe as a nation, we should be rethinking our relationships with governments like Saudi Arabia. And that we have a president who thinks, and of course he lied on this issue as well, thinks selling them $100 billion of arms makes it all very well and good. Of course, he didn't even get the $100 billion. That was a lie as well. What we are here to discuss is the fact that we are living in very, very difficult times, and you guys are struggling with all of these issues. And I know that during this conference, there's going to be some serious discussion about issues like economic justice. And economic justice means that maybe, just maybe, we will be able to begin a discussion in this country on a word that is never seen on television, not read in the newspapers too often. It's called poverty. Got 40 million people, including more than a few in this beautiful state, who are struggling every single day to keep their heads above water. In this state and all over this country, people are working at 2 or 3 jobs. And everybody in this room knows that while unemployment today is relatively low, that does not mean that tens of millions of families do not continue to struggle. And that is why, because of the work that people in this room have done, and others, of course, who are not here, people like Fight for 15, the very good news is that issues that we talked about, Nina will remember this, and Cornell will remember this, and Jane will remember this, all of us who are on the campaign trail together. The ideas that we raised, where every day the editorial pages would say these are extreme, these are radical, the American people don't want it. It turns out that that is exactly what the American people wanted. Not shockingly, it turns out that the American people believe that if you work 40 hours a week in America, you should not be living in poverty. And I want you all to think, and this is where I am hopeful, is that just a few years ago, when we talked about $15 an hour as a minimum wage, we were thought to be extremist and fringe people. All right? But in 3 years, a lot has happened. We have cities and towns all over, and states all over this country passing $15 an hour minimum wage. We forced Amazon and Disney to go to $15 an hour. And I am absolutely confident that when the grassroots continues to mobilize and stand up and fight for economic justice, we are going to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage bill. And when we talk about economic justice, we, as progressives, have the guts to talk about issues that you're not going to see on the television or here in the Congress. And that is the moral issue. The moral issue. Cornell and others put morality into the political debate. Is it appropriate that 3 billionaires own more wealth than the bottom half of the American people? Is it appropriate that the top 0.1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, and that we have in this wealthy country the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major nation on earth? Now, the TV folks may not like it, and the establishment may not like it, and Wall Street may not like it. But this is a profound issue. This issue of income and wealth inequality is a profound issue. It is a moral issue. It is an economic issue, and it is a political issue. Because we have got to stand up, as all of you know, to a corrupt campaign finance system where these very same billionaires are buying elections. And I know that's an issue you will be talking about this weekend. You know, I saw Jane Kim. Where's Jane? Yeah, when I was out in San Francisco, we were talking about the crisis of affordable housing. And I thought, well, that's a San Francisco issue or maybe a Seattle issue. Guess what? It is an issue all across this country, including this city that you're in right now. And that people, young people often, working people, cannot find decent housing. Maybe it's time we started talking about building the millions of units of affordable housing that we need in this country. And when we talk about, one of the things that the role that we can play and that you are playing and that we are all playing is forcing discussion about issues that the establishment does not want discussed. And it's not only that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. You got working people today in Vermont, all over this country. They're going to work. It is not too much to ask that they have affordable, quality child care for their children. This is not a radical idea. It is not a radical idea. Other countries are doing it. Every psychologist who studies human behavior understands that the ages of 0 through 4 are the most important years of a human being's development. How in God's earth can we turn our backs on those little children and not provide them with the nurturing and the intellectual life that they need as little children? So one of our jobs is to force discussion on issues that are not only right, but in fact what the American people want. I'll give you another example. And I see Roseanne DeMoro here, many of you. A few years ago, we raised the issue. Hey, maybe, this is really radical idea, my God. Not to be discussed on television for sure. Not to be discussed in the halls of Congress. Maybe the wealthiest country in the history of the world, 50 miles away from the Canadian border. Maybe, just maybe, we might want to do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege. Oh, my God. Did we get attacked for that idea? Oh, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for that? We're spending now twice as much as the folks 50 miles away from us spend. They manage to guarantee health care to all of their people. Yeah, I think we can figure out a way to pay for it. And I guess that's something going to be discussing this weekend, all right? But here is my point. We began that so-called radical discussion, and 3 years came and gone. The last 2 polls that I saw on the issue of health care has 70% of the American people supporting Medicare for all single-payer system. And there are more people in the freshman class in the United States Congress who support Medicare for all than ever before. We're here not just to talk about economic issues. We're here this weekend to be talking about racial and social justice. We're here to be talking about ending, in all of its many and varied forms, institutional racism. And that is not, when we think about that, everyone says, well, we got a criminal justice system, it's really broken. In many ways, it's racist, terrible, terrible, terrible. Yeah, that's true. And we have to address why we have more people in jail than any other country. Why tonight, as we are here, hundreds of thousands of Americans are behind bars. Do you know why they're behind bars? They're behind bars because they cannot afford bail to get out of jail. And we got to talk about this incredibly destructive so-called war on drugs and the horror that that has done to millions of people who are arrested for the crime of possessing marijuana. And again, this is an area, and I want you to appreciate this, we are making real progress. You are now in a state, one of a growing number of states, that has legalized possession of marijuana. All right? And there is serious discussion now all over the country because of groups like the ACLU, Black Lives Matter, and others about fundamental reforms of the criminal justice system. But when you talk about racial disparities, it is not just criminal justice. It is health disparities. It is housing disparities. It is wealth disparities. It is education disparities. And when we stand together and begin addressing these issues, not only are we doing the work of justice, in many ways we're creating jobs, we're bringing our people together. I know this is an issue that you will be discussing over the weekend. And we're here to talk about sexism. We're here to talk about homophobia. We're here to talk about religious bigotry. And I know we're also going to be talking about this war on undocumented immigrants. But even here, despite Trump's demagoguery on this issue, I want everybody here to know that poll after poll shows that the American people are in a very different place than Donald Trump. 80% of the American people think we should provide legal protection to the 1.8 million young people in the DACA program or eligible for DACA. A majority of the American people believe in comprehensive immigration reform and a path toward citizenship. The overwhelming majority of the American people do not support the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And people want us to move toward public funding of elections, and we're seeing progress in that area. We're seeing some progress in taking on the outrageous level of voter suppression and gerrymandering. All right? But clearly, if we're going to create the country we know we have to create, we have to take on not only a corrupt campaign finance system, but a corrupt election system as well. Now, we just came through a campaign which I know many of you worked very, very hard on. We didn't get everything we wanted. I would have loved to become chairman of the Budget Committee. Unless Mitch McConnell does something very, very strange, I think that is not going to happen. But on the other hand, our brothers and sisters in the House did well. They won some 40 seats. And let me tell you why it is extremely important that the Democrats now control the House. And it is not only for the very important reason of providing oversight to a president and administration which is essentially out of control in many areas. All right, so some questions are going to be asked, I believe, and I'm quite sure, about is Trump's relationship to Putin and Saudi Arabia just based on his governmental judgment regarding governmental policy, or is there something more there regarding financial interest as well? The president thinks that his administration did a brilliant job in Puerto Rico after the terrible hurricane there. I think his administration will start answering some questions about a not-so-wonderful job that they did there and other questions. But here's what is even more important. For the last 2 years, you've had a Senate that was bad and a House that was even worse. So many of the issues that we will be discussing this evening and this weekend never even surfaced. What is going to start happening now is legislation, and I hope that will be strong legislation, is going to start passing the House and come to the Senate. And it is a very different situation when you don't have to deal with anything, when you don't have to vote against raising the minimum wage because you don't have a bill on your desk, then when that bill comes over, then you're going to have to explain to the folks back home why you voted no. I hope very much. We worked on a 4-year Medicare for all single-payer program. First year was pretty simple. It said lower the eligibility age for Medicare from 65 to 55, cover all of the children, lower the cost of prescription drugs. I hope our colleagues in the House bring that bill over to the Senate. And my guess is that 80% of the American people support that. And if the senators want to vote against it, they're going to have to explain that to the folks back home. So let me conclude by saying this. There are enormous problems facing this country. All of you are familiar with the 2 reports that have come out in the last month regarding climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, probably the most comprehensive study ever done, talks about the fact that we have 12 years, which is no time at all, to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, or we're going to see irreparable harm done to this planet. What we have seen, the tragedy that we have seen in California, 85 people dead, 14,000 housing units destroyed. What they are telling us is if we do not get our act together, that is going to become commonplace, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Rising sea levels, flooding, the acidification of the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So we got a whole lot of issues out there that we have got to address. But the point that I want to leave you with, the main point that I want to leave you with, as somebody who has traveled all across this country, is that on issue after issue, whether it's common sense gun safety legislation, whether it is making sure that our kids can afford to go to college and not leave school $50,000 or $100,000 in debt, whether it's immigration reform, whether it is criminal justice reform, whether it is telling the billionaires that they're not going to get a tax break, but in fact they're going to start paying their fair share of taxes. Whether it is any of those issues and even more, I want you all to know that the American people are with us on those issues. The Republicans did not run any 30-second ads which said, vote for candidate X so we can give a tax break to the rich and cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I don't think they ran those ads because nobody supports that agenda, which is their agenda. All right? But people do believe in our ideas. So what do? First of all, we have got to make sure that the Democratic Party is not just a party of the East Coast and the West Coast. It is a party of every state in this country. Our job is to make sure that the issues that we deal with, that people understand, they impact black families in New York City, they impact white families in Kansas, and Latino families in Los Angeles. All right. Our job is to do exactly the opposite of what Trump is trying to do. He is trying to divide us up based on the color of our skin, our sexual orientation, our religion, where we were born. Our job is to bring our people together around a strong, progressive agenda that speaks to the needs of all and not just the 1%.
Senator Bernie Sanders speaking at the opening of the Sanders Institute gathering here in Burlington, Vermont. Among those attending are Native American leader Winona LaDuke, who will join us on Monday's broadcast, and former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis will be on Tuesday's show. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for a full-time social media manager based in New York City. You can get details at democracynow.org. And a very belated happy birthday to Dina Guzder. Special thank you to the Vermont PBS team here in Colchester, Dave Rice, Holt Albee, Sarah Wentworth, Stephen Weigel, Mike Dunn, Brian Stevenson, Keith Swan, Josh Seacard, and Dana Nahomic, as well as Democracy Now!'s Dennis Moynihan, John Hamilton, and Libby Rainey. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, Taymare Estudio, Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Gran. I'm Amy Goodman from Vermont PBS. Thanks so much for joining us.